It's the smallest acts that weigh the heaviest when no one's supposed to be watching. There's a rhythm to Bobby Huffman's life. Engine hum, white lines, silence. Not peace, he wouldn't call it that, but silence. After 22 years on the road and one divorce that left him with half a house and a full ache in his ribs every time he drove past a school, Bobby learned not to reach too far ahead of his own headlights. He hauled loads coast to coast, just him and his old Kenworth W900, 2 thermoses, and 1 photo taped to the sun visor. The photo was the only thing he ever let stay out of place. His son Luke in a Little League uniform, dirt on his cheek, laughing like the world hadn't already taken its share. Bobby hadn't seen him in 5 years, maybe 6. Time got strange when the miles blurred together. His dispatcher Ray called him Iron Gut, but Bobby had ulcers the size of nickels. He just didn't talk about pain, not the physical kind, not the other. That's how men like him were raised. You drive, you deliver, you shut up, keep your schedule, meet your deadlines, and if the sky falls on your cab, you radio it in and keep going if your wheels still turn. On that Thursday, Bobby was running heavy with a double load of produce, apples and romaine, all bound for Salt Lake from Bakersfield. He was already behind. Some slow-ass forklift driver in Fresno took forever strapping down the crates, and now Bobby was losing daylight, chasing a schedule he'd never agreed to but still blamed himself for slipping. That's when he saw the van. Off to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking like a heartbeat fading out. The hood was popped and someone was waving their arms, not frantically, but steadily, intentional, like they knew they had one shot at being noticed before the trucks just roared by again. Bobby's eyes flicked to the clock. If he stopped, he'd lose another 20 minutes, minimum, more if it was serious. He looked back at the road, hands tightening on the wheel. Keep going. Keep moving. Ain't your problem. But then he glanced at the visor. Luke's picture caught a sliver of golden light through the windshield, and Bobby pulled over. His truck hissed to a stop 20 feet behind the van. Before he even stepped out, he saw them. Woman, early 30s maybe, long dark hair pinned behind her ears, standing beside the van with a boy and a girl huddled close to her. Kids couldn't be older than 10. The little one was crying, shoulders shaking hard. The boy just looked tired. No whining, no drama, just done. "Ma'am," Bobby called as he walked up, voice rough from disuse. "You all right?" The woman turned. Her eyes went wide at the size of him. Bobby stood 6'2", built like a former linebacker who never stopped benching even after quitting the team. But she didn't flinch. She didn't step back. Just nodded, then looked toward the engine. Belt snapped. "We've been out here almost an hour, no signal. I tried flagging people down, but you're the first to stop." Bobby squinted under his cap. "You call for roadside?" She shook her head, motioning to the lifeless phone in her hand. "Battery's dead." "Figures, right?" He peered into the van. Crumbs on the floor, coloring books, a stuffed unicorn wedged between the seat cushions. Signs of real life, not vacation. "You headed far?" he asked. "Couple exits up. Trying to get to my brother's. Our heater's out, and I didn't want the kids freezing tonight." Bobby paused. He looked at the little girl clinging to her mom's leg, thumb in her mouth. "You got car seats?" "Yeah, but no way they walkin', and this cold's cutting through their jackets already." He rubbed his jaw. This wasn't a gas issue. Wasn't something he could patch up and pretend he tried, and he'd seen enough wrecks on shoulders like this to know what happened when you left families exposed on the side of an interstate curve. "All right," he muttered. "Come on, load 'em up. I'll take you to that exit." Her eyes lit up, then dimmed again with caution. "You sure? I mean, is that allowed?" He almost chuckled. "Ain't much in this world that's allowed anymore, ma'am, but it's the right thing." She opened the van door, her hands trembling more from nerves than cold now. "Mariah," she said. "My name's Mariah Jensen." "Bobby," he replied. holding out a calloused hand. "Bobby Huffman." The kids didn't say much as they climbed up into the cab. The girl sat on Mariah's lap. The boy took the jump seat. Bobby watched in the mirror as she buckled them in, one hand on each of their shoulders, eyes flicking between them like she was counting the seconds until they were warm again. The ride to the service station was short but thick with the kind of silence that said more than words. Bobby kept his eyes on the road, but his ears stayed open. Mariah murmured to her daughter, rubbed her arms. The boy stared out the window like he'd seen too much for someone his age. Bobby understood that look. He'd worn it himself at 16 after his own old man disappeared into a whiskey bottle and never came back out. When they got to the Chevron, he pulled alongside the curb and cut the engine. Mariah turned to him, eyes glossy. "I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to—" "I know," he interrupted, voice low, "but you've done enough." She blinked, confused. "You've raised good kids. That's more than most do. Stay safe tonight, all right?" He handed her a 20 from the console. "Get 'em something warm to eat inside. Ain't much, but—" Mariah looked like she wanted to argue, but she took it. Not because she needed it, but because she saw it mattered to him that she did. Bobby didn't wait for applause. He never did. Just nodded once and shifted the truck back into gear. As he pulled away, he didn't notice the station clerk watching from inside. A young guy in a marine hoodie leaning on the counter, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He hadn't missed a thing. And he knew the emblem on Bobby's rear bumper. Subtle, but real. Vietnam veteran. By morning, that quiet act of kindness would echo louder than Bobby ever expected, but for now, the hum of the engine returned, and Bobby's eyes settled once more on the long stretch of road ahead. Bobby didn't look back. That was his rule. Drop a load, drop a favor, drop a memory. Keep rolling. He'd made the mistake once in his younger days of letting something linger in his rear view, and it had cost him more than time. These days, he kept his gaze fixed forward and his mind on the next way station. But the thing was, he did look back. Half a mile down the road, he flipped his side mirror up a notch, just enough to see the outline of the service station slowly shrinking behind him. He caught a final glimpse of the woman and her kids, Mariah with one arm around each of them, crouched by the station's entrance like they were sheltering in a storm. The boy looked up toward the cab. Maybe he felt it too, that something had shifted. The mirror slipped out of angle with a bump in the road, and Bobby left it. The Kenworth rumbled into the night, engine thrumming beneath him like an old friend, telling the same tired story. Bobby's fingers tapped the steering wheel out of rhythm, an unconscious drumbeat trying to chase off the echo of voices that still lingered in the cab. He wasn't a man prone to sentiment, but the silence now felt colder than before. He stopped at a Love's truck stop an hour later, needing coffee more than fuel. Inside, he got the usual, black, hot, no sugar, no cream. He nodded to the cashier, a young woman with tired eyes and bright blue nails typing on her phone between customers. She gave him the kind of half-smile that lived somewhere between politeness and autopilot. He appreciated it more than she'd know. Back in his cab, coffee in hand, Bobby unfolded his logbook and stared at the mileage. He was nearly 90 minutes behind now. Any dispatcher worth their salt would see the gap and ask questions. Ray wasn't the curious type, but late meant late, and late meant headaches. Bobby told himself he'd just lie if asked. Traffic, tire pressure, whatever worked. But even as he said it in his head, he knew he wouldn't. Bobby didn't lie, not even the easy one. He adjusted the seat, took a long sip of coffee, and reached for the visor. Luke's picture was still there, still grinning, still 11 years old. Bobby swallowed the knot in his throat. He started the engine again and drove into the dark. 2 hours passed. The sky hung black above the desert stretch. The stars pinpricked through the windshield like someone had pushed a sewing needle through a velvet sheet. Bobby's mind drifted, as it did sometimes during these endless legs of the trip. He thought of the way Mariah's hands had shaken, the way her voice hadn't cracked, even when it looked like it should have. That was Marine wife grit, no question. He'd seen it before, saw it in his sister-in-law before cancer stole her. He wondered about the father. No rings on her fingers, but there was something about her that said she hadn't stopped waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. He turned on the radio to chase away the thoughts, flipping past stations until he landed on one with a man speaking low and steady about highway ghosts and rest-stop hauntings. Strange, but the voice calmed him. That's when he saw it. The headlights in the distance, coming up fast behind him. Too fast for a normal sedan. Bobby checked the speedometer, tapped the brakes gently, eased into the right lane. The vehicle passed. An unmarked dark SUV with government plates. Bobby's brow furrowed. Federal, maybe, or military, hard to say, but it wasn't just the plates. It was the man in the passenger seat. Even in the dark, Bobby caught a glimpse of a sharp haircut, squared shoulders, eyes locked dead ahead like he was driving into battle. They didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge, just blew past him and vanished into the horizon. 10 minutes later, Bobby hit the next exit, another rest area with 2 rigs parked, a broken vending machine light flickering like a warning. He wasn't tired, but his gut told him to pull over anyway. Maybe for sleep, maybe for something else. He parked in the last slot, cut the engine, and leaned back. A knock on the cab door jerked him upright. He looked out the side window, saw a figure, tall, broad, wearing a crisp field jacket, the kind Bobby hadn't seen outside of a base in years. He reached for the window crank, lowered it slowly. "You Bobby Huffman?" the man asked, voice calm but firm. Bobby nodded, cautious. "Depends who's asking." The man held up a badge. "Not police, not state trooper. U.S. Marine Corps liaison." Bobby's blood chilled, then warmed, then spun all at once. "Mind if I have a word? Don't suppose I've got a choice." The man smiled faintly. "You always have a choice, Mr. Huffman. That's what brought us here." Bobby climbed down from the cab. The air was sharp, desert cold, and the wind tugged at the edge of his jacket. "Name's Colonel Richard Sloan," the man said, offering his hand. Bobby shook it. Firm grip, no nonsense. "A few hours ago," Sloan began, "a woman and her 2 kids walked into a service station a few miles north of Barstow. Cold, stranded, shaken, but safe. Clerk recognized the Marine Corps memorial bracelet on the woman's wrist. Called a buddy. Word made it up the chain." Bobby said nothing, just nodded once. "She told them what happened," Sloan continued. "Told them you stopped. Gave them a ride, fed the kids, gave her money. You didn't know she was a widow. Didn't ask for anything in return. That sit right with you?" Bobby looked him in the eye. "Didn't do it for credit." "I know," Sloan said, smile returning, a little warmer now. "But that's the thing about honor, Mr. Huffman. The people who show it without asking, those are the ones we need to recognize." Bobby shifted his boots in the gravel, uncomfortable. Sloan pulled something from his coat. A manila envelope, sealed. "Inside's a letter," he said, "from the commandant's office, and a certificate, small token of appreciation." Bobby raised an eyebrow. "Appreciation for what?" "For doing what most don't." Sloan held it out. Bobby didn't move to take it. "I'm not the kind of man who needs things," he said. "I know," Sloan replied, "but this isn't just about you. It's about the ones watching." Bobby looked past him, then, at the other trucks, at the shadows moving through the station, at the empty roads that stretched back to the van and the kids, and the moment he chose to pull over instead of pass. He took the envelope. Sloan nodded once. "Semper Fi, Mr. Huffman." Bobby looked down at the sealed edge. "I wasn't a Marine." Sloan smiled. "No, but tonight you acted like one." And just like that, the colonel turned, walked back to the SUV waiting by the edge of the parking lot, and drove off into the dark. Bobby stood there a long while after, envelope in hand, wind tugging gently at the corners of his coat. Eventually he climbed back into his cab. He didn't tape the envelope next to Luke's photo, but he didn't stash it away either. He let it sit right there on the dash, catching the glow of the console lights as the engine rumbled back to life. He still had miles to go. But this time, something in the silence felt a little warmer. There wasn't a ceremony, no bugles, no salutes. Bobby preferred it that way. By the time he'd dropped his load in Salt Lake, he'd almost convinced himself the whole thing with Colonel Sloan had been a mirage conjured by too much coffee and too many hours on the road. The envelope was real, though, still sitting unopened on the dash. It seemed to glow faintly in the early morning light, daring him to tear it open. He hadn't yet. Maybe he was afraid it would make the whole thing permanent. Or maybe, deep down, he didn't think he deserved it. He checked his mirrors, shifted gears, and eased back onto I-15. Dispatch had him routed toward Denver next. Another fresh produce load waiting for pickup outside Ogden, another round of paperwork, another run of frozen radio silence, just the way he liked it, or thought he did. Something had changed since that night on the shoulder, not just in him, but around him. He started noticing the nods, the glances. At rest stops and fuel pumps, drivers he didn't know would meet his eyes and hold them a second longer than usual. One guy in a flannel jacket tapped his truck twice and said, "Heard about what you did?" Bobby didn't reply, just climbed back into his rig, confused and a little uncomfortable. At the next stop, the cashier handed him a coffee on the house. "You're that guy, right? From the thing with the woman and the kids?" Bobby stared. "What thing?" He shrugged like she didn't want to press. "Guy who helped that Marine widow in the storm? Word gets around. Lot of us got family in the service." Bobby mumbled a quiet thanks and walked out. He didn't understand it. He hadn't told anyone. Hell, he'd barely spoken about it even in his own head. But somehow, somewhere along the chain of convoy chatter and military networks, his name had gotten attached to something bigger than himself. And no matter how many times he tried to push it away, the world kept reflecting it back to him. The real surprise came 3 days later, just outside of Rawlins, Wyoming. He was parked at a remote trucker diner off US 287, a no-frills joint with laminate tables and laminated menus. The kind of place where the coffee never emptied and the jukebox played country ballads from a decade no one liked to admit they remembered. Bobby was finishing his eggs when the bell above the door jingled. He didn't look up at first, but the air shifted, a hush falling like someone had hit the mute button on the world. Something in the posture of the diner changed. Waitresses froze mid-pour, and every driver at the counter seemed to straighten just a little. Then a voice rang out. "Which one of you's Bobby Huffman?" Bobby looked up. A man in desert camouflage stood just inside the doorway, arms folded, chest like a brick wall. Younger than Sloan, but with the same unmistakable bearing. Behind him were 3 others, 2 men, 1 woman, all wearing some version of the same uniform. One of them carried a small box. The other had what looked like a folded garment bag slung over her shoulder. Bobby stood slowly, his chair scraping the tile floor. His first instinct was to duck out the back and pretend none of this was happening, but too many eyes were on him now. "That's me," he said quietly. The Marine walked over and extended his hand. "Staff Sergeant Donnelly, sir, U.S. Marine Corps, Camp Pendleton. We've been asked to deliver something personally." Bobby looked down at the hand, shook it, then stared as Donnelly reached into his jacket and pulled out a crisp navy pule envelope with a gold-embossed seal. The room was silent. "We don't normally do this," Donnelly said, but Colonel Sloan insisted. Said the gesture mattered. He handed the envelope over and motioned to the woman, who stepped forward and opened the garment bag. Inside was a folded flag, a plaque, and beneath it a framed certificate. Bobby didn't need to read it. The crest said it all. Department of the Navy, U.S. Marine Corps. The waitress closest to him gasped. Someone at the back of the diner let out a low whistle. Bobby felt the heat rise in his neck. He didn't do well with eyes on him, never had. But something told him this wasn't about him anymore. Not entirely. Donnelly nodded once. You stopped. You put others before yourself. Doesn't matter that you weren't military. You acted like one of us, and we don't forget that. The younger Marine, barely out of his teens, stepped forward with a grin. My mom was a driver. Told me truckers don't get enough credit. Figured we'd start changing that. Bobby blinked. Took the envelope. Then the flag. He didn't know what to say, so he just muttered, I was just trying to do the right thing. That's exactly why you're standing here, Donnelly replied. They didn't stay long. Just a few more words, a couple handshakes, a quiet nod to the other drivers in the room. Then they were gone, boots echoing out the door, their mission complete. Bobby sat back down, the plaque resting against his thigh, the envelope unopened in his hand. The waitress brought over another cup of coffee without asking. She didn't speak, just squeezed his shoulder once, gently, and walked away. He stared at the plaque, at the reflection of himself in the glass. It didn't look right, not because it didn't belong to him, but because it did, and that was something he still hadn't come to terms with. He ate the rest of his breakfast in silence, but when he paid the bill and stepped outside, the man at the next pump leaned over and said, You did good, brother. My dad was a Marine. He'd have liked you. Bobby nodded. He didn't say thank you. Couldn't. The words stuck somewhere behind the wall he'd built to survive 20 years of solitude on the road. But as he climbed back into the cab, he glanced at the dash. Luke's picture still hung there, grinning. Next to it now, resting neatly, securely, was the folded flag. And this time, Bobby didn't drive away pretending nothing had changed. Because everything had. 3 weeks later, Bobby Huffman sat in the cab of his truck, staring at the cracked windshield that spiderwebbed across the top right corner. He kept telling himself he'd get it fixed. But the truth was, he kind of liked it now. It reminded him that life was always a little imperfect, always marked by some unexpected impact. He'd survived worse. His route had taken him east again, this time toward Kansas City. The sun was low, a honeyed blur behind a stretch of clouds that didn't look ready to do anything about it. On the dash, beside Luke's photo and the folded flag, sat a new addition, a small note handwritten on the back of a gas receipt that simply read, Thank you for stopping. You reminded me I'm not alone. Mariah. Bobby had found it wedged into the folded edge of the envelope he finally opened last week. It hadn't made him cry. He didn't cry. But he did take the rest of the day off, parked his truck in a quiet lot in Colorado Springs, sat on the tailgate, and watched birds fight over breadcrumbs for 3 full hours. That was enough. Now, as his rig hummed eastward, something in his bones told him this chapter, whatever it was reaching its end. When he pulled into the truck stop just west of Topeka, he didn't expect the man waiting there. Ray, his dispatcher, sat on the bench by the diesel pumps, holding a clipboard and chewing on a toothpick like it had wronged him personally. Bobby parked, shut off the engine, climbed out. Thought you hated leaving your desk, he muttered. Ray smirked. I hate surprises more. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands. Just stood there eyeing each other like 2 old trees trying to decide if the wind was worth bending for. Ray finally spoke. You got people asking about you, military folks, news folks. Even a pastor from some little church in Nevada said you gave his daughter and grandkids a ride during a blizzard. That true? Bobby shrugged. Might have happened. Ray scratched his head. You becoming a folk hero and didn't tell me? Didn't know folk heroes still wore denim and smelled like diesel. Guess they do now. They shared a laugh. It was short, but it felt good. Ray handed him the clipboard. New route, short one. You're due for a break. Bobby skimmed it. Destination caught his eye. El Paso, Texas. What's in El Paso? He asked. Ray hesitated. Something I didn't think you'd say yes to unless I just sent it. Bobby waited. Ray pulled out a folded flyer from his back pocket and handed it over. It was for a small nonprofit, American Roads Home. a new organization that paired veteran widows and families with volunteer drivers who helped them relocate, resettle, or just get through emergencies. Below the logo, written in bold ink, were the words, Bobby Huffman, honorary sponsor, first recipient of the Roads Guardian Award. Bobby stared at it. I didn't sign up for this. You didn't have to, Ray said. Someone else did. That woman, Mariah. She's working with them now. Guess that ride meant something. Bobby's throat felt dry. He folded the flyer, tucked it in his jacket, nodded once. Ray motioned toward the pumps. Fuel's on the house. Company says you brought us more goodwill than any marketing team ever could. Bobby didn't argue. He topped off the tank and hit the road again, heart heavier and lighter at the same time. El Paso was 10 hours away. Along the way, he passed towns he hadn't seen in years. Roads that once felt cold now felt warm in their familiarity. In Amarillo, a father and son waved at him from an overpass, holding a cardboard sign that said, "Thank you, drivers." He honked twice. They cheered. The closer he got to Texas, the more the miles felt less like a burden and more like a path home. By the time he reached the American Roads Home office, a modest trailer parked behind a church community center, it was nearly dusk. The building wasn't much, but the sign was clear. A big red-white banner hung across the siding. Welcome, Mr. Huffman. He almost didn't go in. Old habits, quiet pride. But the door opened before he could turn away. Mariah stepped out, Sophie clinging to her leg, Eli standing just behind. She smiled. Took you long enough. He nodded, unsure what to say, but Sophie broke the silence. You're the one who brought us hot chocolate, she said, voice small but certain. Bobby smiled. That sounds like something I'd do. Eli stepped forward and handed him a drawing. Crayon on construction paper. It was a picture of a big red truck with angel wings. Above it, the words, Thank you, Mr. Bobby. You're our hero. Bobby took it, studied it like it was a map to something sacred. I'm no hero, he murmured. Mariah put a hand on his arm. You are to us. Inside, they offered him dinner, just stew and cornbread. He ate with the kids, laughed once when Sophie spilled lemonade all over his lap. Then they asked him to stay the night. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. That night, for the first time in a long while, Bobby didn't sleep in his truck. He stayed in the guest room, a real bed, a quiet ceiling fan, a folded note on the pillow that read, Sometimes the road leads you exactly where you're needed. The next morning he stood outside the community center as the sun climbed over the horizon. Mariah poured him coffee in a to-go cup, handed it over with a tired smile. What's next for you? She asked. He looked out over the highway, thought for a long moment. I think, he said slowly, I'll keep driving. But maybe now I drive for more than just freight. She nodded. There are a lot of families out there. You could help. He looked down at Sophie, now clinging to his leg instead of Mariah's. Maybe I will. As he climbed into his cab, he saw the drawing taped to the dash next to Luke's photo. Eli must have done it when he wasn't looking. The engine roared to life. He pulled out onto the road again. But this time, he didn't drive alone. Because the road remembered. And now, so did everyone else.